Brad Edwards, I hope you're doing well. Welcome into the game in Tuscaloosa.
I am doing well. Had a fun weekend of college football, and looking forward to another one.
Yeah, I think that was probably the best weekend so far, right? I mean, it was a great
Yeah.
weekend.
Well, look, the biggest thing was that we got the first real surprise of the season. I mean, I was saying it at the very beginning of the show on Saturday, not expecting that anything was going to change, and that it was very unusual to have a college football season that got that deep into it without a single one of the preseason top 6 teams having lost yet. And we weren't expecting it to happen on Saturday, but it did. And so, that on top of a couple of, games between highly ranked teams gave us a lot to talk about. And it's funny, I think the upset of Georgia ended up really stealing the headlines away from, what was, up until the final few minutes, a really good game between Florida and LSU.
Yeah, when you look at Kirby Smart in Athens, are they convincingly better with Kirby Smart than they were with Mark Richt?
Well, I understand people are talking about that, with the just the overall record through this number of games and all those types of things. To me, they seem a lot better than they were. Look, there's no question. Both guys inherited a talented roster. Kirby, clearly did more with it in the first few years. Now, Rick actually, they were surprising some people early on his tenure, but they never came close to doing, what Georgia did a couple of years ago and nearly winning the national championship. Obviously, they were really close to being in the playoff last year. And so I just think not only has Kirby done a little bit more with that talent, but looking at what he's building, I mean, Rick always had top 10 recruiting classes, but Kirby's at a different level. Now, that also opens the door to more criticism because I think when people recognize that you have a higher level of talent, more is going to be expected of you. And I think there were a lot of teams that Georgia was playing against in the SEC that you would say had very similar talent to them. So when they would lose those games, I think Georgia fans were disappointed, that they weren't winning these kind of toss-up feeling games. But with Kirby, I mean, outside of playing Alabama, they should be beating everyone else because on paper they got more talent than all of them. So a loss like this past weekend, while that would have been really disappointing, for Georgia fans that it happened to Rick, it's even more so with Kirby because I think you recognize this roster is more talented than the ones that Rick had.
Do you see this impacting Georgia going into it, or do you feel like that they really still control their own destiny? I mean, they went out, they go to Atlanta, they're able to win the SEC. Do you still see them in the college football playoffs?
I mean, I don't have a great feeling about them right now, but
Okay.
I try to take myself back to last year, when it was pretty much the same time. I mean, it was in October when they went to Baton Rouge and got blown out by LSU. And their offense did not look good in that game at all. So if you're looking for a similarity, that's what it is that their offense kind of hit rock bottom for the season sometime around the middle of October. And, then they came back after that, and they obviously just cranked it up a notch or two and ran the table. And like I said, nearly beat Alabama, nearly, made it into the playoff. And they could do the same thing again. But I think the reason that this one feels different, I was just looking at this right before you guys called me, is that it's because of the competition that they have. I was looking back at the week after they lost to LSU last year. Our FPI number, the rating for Georgia, which is the number of points above an average FBS team that someone is believed to be. Georgia and their number's almost identical right now to what it was after they lost to LSU last year. They're right around 24 points above average. The difference is that last year, at that same time, they had one team left on their regular season schedule that was believed to be within 10 points of them, and that was Florida. This year, there are 4 teams left on their schedule that FPI believes are within 10 points of them, and Florida is much closer to them than they were a year ago. And so that's where the difference is that, it wasn't just what they did against South Carolina. It's that if you look at the Notre Dame game, the first half of the Tennessee game, they've looked beatable. I don't mean beatable by playoff caliber teams. They've looked beatable by kind of average SEC teams for more than once this season, I guess is the best way to say it. And so that's what doesn't give you a ton of confidence that they're just going to bounce back and do the same thing they did last year, because you can see some flaws, and they've just got more competition than they did a year ago.
Brett, I think you could also say similar things about Alabama. I mean, it's simple. I don't see a margin, or I don't see a pathway that Alabama can backdoor. It's simply about winning out. If they lose and they slip up, I don't know if this team could backdoor it like they've done in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you kind of look at, first of all, maybe if they got into the SEC championship game undefeated and lost that.
Okay, yeah, right. I can see that. Yeah.
But even then, I mean, you still, despite what happened a couple of weeks ago against North Carolina, you're still expecting Clemson to be undefeated. That's going to be one spot. You're looking at, I can't imagine Ohio State losing more than one game if they lose at all. So there's another one. And now that Oklahoma's gotten past Texas, I mean, unless they get upset in the Big 12 championship game, there's probably another one there. So I don't know that there's a spot for a second SEC team. And I think that's where you start to get worried if you're an Alabama or LSU. The loser of that game, as much as you could make a grade out of the four best teams still, I don't think the way that the committee looks at it, there's going to be a spot for them. Unless the only condition I could see, like I mentioned, if they were to lose in the conference championship game, let's say that Georgia beats Florida but loses at Auburn, and so Georgia's a 2-loss team going into the SEC championship game, and say Georgia were to beat Alabama. I could see maybe the committee takes the 1-loss Alabama over the 2-loss Georgia. It's a possibility, but there's so many contingencies. But I think what it boils down to, like I said before, is that I don't see the cooperation from the other conferences out there where there are multiple, Power 5 champions with more than one loss. I mean, barring some upsets in conference title games, I think it's looking like a year where the SEC is only going to get one team, and that sure puts a lot of pressure, on a team like Alabama. And look, I guess what they have to hope for is that LSU takes care of Auburn, and then if Alabama can knock off LSU, they could survive a loss at Auburn. I think that's obviously what got them 2 years ago and put them in that spot where they had to sweat it out. And it's possible that they might not, they might be able to overcome that loss this year. But outside of that, I don't know if there's another game that they could afford to lose.
Brad, we've watched the AP poll drop Clemson down to 3. Look ahead in the crystal ball as you look at their schedule. We told Central Florida a couple of years ago, hey, you don't belong because of your strength of schedule. You don't belong. If you look at Clemson, could you come up with a scenario that they could be left out of this Final Four, even if they do remain undefeated?
No,
okay.
No, not undefeated. I will believe it when I see it, that a Power 5 undefeated team gets left out.
Okay.
And look, I mean, I guess if you were to try to come up with a scenario where there are more than 4 undefeated Power 5s, okay, obviously at that point someone's going to get left out. But it's not going to happen this year. And now, one thing this past weekend did, not only did it give us something to talk about with Georgia, but with South Carolina, you figure, okay, if they can get healthy, and especially a quarterback, then maybe, if Clemson doesn't, crank it up another notch or two from where they are right now, maybe, Clemson going into Columbia late in the season, there's a chance for an upset there. And if Clemson were to lose that game, they could still win the ACC and be sitting there with one loss. But I don't think they would have a win over a top 25 team, because A&M's not going to finish in the top 25.
Right? Yeah, they would not. Yeah, there's no way. I mean, I don't see it.
Yeah, so that would be the first big test for what you're talking about. It's like, if because even if they beat South Carolina, they're not going to have a win. More than likely, will not have a single win over the committee's top 25. And so you could argue that, okay, maybe Clemson needs to dominate, but I think they will. I don't see a lot more games like the North Carolina one in front of us. I would be shocked if they had more than one game the rest of the way that was competitive. But I think there is some pressure on them to win big, because that's almost a given at this point that they're not going to have a win over the committee's top 25. So there will certainly be people around the country who are trying to make the case that they don't belong, even if they're undefeated. And that's why the eye test comes into play, because it's not just a simple formula of, looking at this thing or that thing. There are all sorts of ways different committee members look at it. And how good you look is obviously a big one.
We're talking to Brad Edwards, ESPN College Radio, College Game Day Radio that you can hear right here on Tide 100.9. He's also part of the Stats and Information Group at ESPN. Brad, as we move into this Alabama-LSU game, I know we're a couple of weeks early, but no, don't tell Nick Saban. But we're not going to be focused too much on Tennessee or Arkansas. We'll ask you about those.
Come on, man.
Well, it just doesn't do it. I mean, 35
Isn't
and a half
that what
points.
the fans want to talk about?
Well, no, actually, we're discussing today how much the Tennessee rivalry has just went away, and it's the luster of this game. Listen, you went to school at the University of Alabama. That game was huge. I looked at Jacob, my producer, yesterday across the glass, and I was trying to explain to him. He looked at me and he goes, "Man, I was a kid. Like a kid in diapers the last time Tennessee beat Alabama." I know I exaggerated by a little bit, but I mean, he said, "I don't remember any of this. I don't ever remember Tennessee being good."
Right. No, I was in a meeting yesterday. We had, kind of in my department, all of our people who work on college football. We have a weekly meeting. We have every Tuesday, and we were in there yesterday, and the game actually came up, and I kind of looked around the room because I could see a lot of young faces in there, people just out of college. And
sure.
I was like, how many of you, of course, they're not all, very few of them are from the South anyway. And I said, how many of you consider Alabama and Tennessee to be a rivalry? And there was like one hand that went up, And I mean, that was their rivalry.
But don't you feel
that's something that's completely foreign to them? And first of all, it's not competitive. You know the thing that I like to repeat, Ryan, that
yes.
I heard when I first arrived at ESPN. Someone was talking about the Yankees and the Red Sox, and now this is once again going way back. Like this is back when the Red Sox were not competitive with the Yankees, and he said, why is this considered a rivalry? He said, do the hammer and the nail have a rivalry? When one keeps banging the other one on top of the head and the other one never hits back, is that a rivalry? And that's what Alabama and Tennessee is right now. It's the hammer and the nail. And so for people who are, under a certain age, that's their entire understanding of Alabama and Tennessee is that it's hammer and nail. Like, when was the last time that Tennessee actually punched back in that rivalry? And I mean, they had a couple times in Tuscaloosa. They came close. But for the most part, since Saban arrived, it has been non-competitive.
Yeah, I did the math. 454, 147. They've outscored Alabama. 12-0 Nick Saban. 454 to 147. Other than that, 2015 final drive when Derrick Henry and Jacob Coker sort of took charge, and then that Mount Cody block in 2009. Other than that, it's been completely blowouts. Yeah,
I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, that's the thing about it, is that it's not just that. There are series, like we could look at Ohio State and Michigan, another, big-time rivalry where it's been very one-sided. But most of those games have been competitive. Ohio State's not going out there and winning by 30 every year. And now, granted, the Michigan teams, most of them have been better than the Tennessee teams that Alabama's been facing. But that's the part that really gives people a hard time with it as far as calling it a rivalry, is that these games aren't even competitive. I mean, most of them have been over at halftime. And so, I mean, I get it. If you're a young Alabama fan, I mean, to you, LSU is way, way more significant than Tennessee when you're looking at the schedule before or during a season.
Brad, let me go to this LSU-Alabama game. Are you buying completely that this LSU team is just completely – I mean, are you bought in? I mean, because I've asked you that several times this year, but it seems like every week by week, like we're further invested that LSU is a real football team with a real threat at college football playoffs.
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any question that they are a very good offensive team. And even though they went into last week having not faced what I would consider a legitimate defense yet, and Florida is legitimate defense, if you want to argue against LSU, you could say, all right, Florida's two best pass rushers were basically out for that. One didn't play, the other one didn't last very long before he went out with injury, and so they weren't playing with the full roster on defense. And I mean that's true, but at the same time, I think LSU showed enough for me to believe that they were going to move the ball no matter who Florida had in there. And while most seasons, I would say, well, Alabama's a different beast when it comes to defense, I don't know that they are this year. So I think LSU is very capable of running up and down the field or throwing up and down the field on Alabama, maybe running a little bit too. But to me, the big question with LSU, when you start to look ahead to that game, is their defense. And we saw Sam Ehlinger with no threat of a running game just throw for, I mean, I don't know how many yards he threw for, but I believe Texas scored on every possession of the second half against LSU in that game. And then, we saw last week, Kyle Trask, once again, Florida not getting a whole lot out of the running game. And yet Trask led them up and down the field, 4 touchdowns just a short ways into the third quarter. And then after that, they had a pick in the end zone, red zone turnover, and then they ended the game inside the 5-yard line. So Florida very easily could have had 42 points in that game, and probably moved the ball well enough to deserve 42 points. And so when you look at what Kyle Trask and Sam Ehlinger have done against that defense, I think it's fair to ask, what do you expect to happen when Tua and those receivers get their shot in Tuscaloosa? I think everyone is right to be excited. This is going to feel like a Big 12 game. I mean, that game from 8 years ago is a distant memory at this point. And it's funny because you had so many people around the country who were kind of sneering at it when it was happening in 2011, and those same people, instead of being excited about it, this year, when it does end up being high scoring, they're going to kind of take the other side, and they're like, "Oh, so now you're playing Big 12 football now," and that's basically what it's become for Alabama and LSU. That they are not as good at defense as they were, and on top of it, the pace at which they're playing, the quickness in which they're scoring, is making it even more difficult for what's already, not one of the better defenses that they've had.
Brad, can I slip in one more question? Because I promised the audience I'd ask you one more question. I haven't been able to get to it. All right. Because I know you have a busy day at ESPN. We're talking to ESPN college football analyst. Do you buy that Joe Burrow has went ahead of Tua Tagovailoa in this Heisman conversation? Because I was looking at ESPN.com. They do a panel of 10 college football analysts, very well-known guys that we like to feature here on the program. And it looks like that Joe Burrow has slipped ahead of Tua Tagovailoa. That seems to be also the national narrative as well.
Well, I mean, I buy that he's ahead of him in what they'd call straw polls right now, but I don't buy that means anything. Mainly because they're going to go head to head, and more than likely, whichever team wins that game, that team's quarterback is going to be the one that kind of takes the Heisman lead. But even beyond that, I think with Tua, and I know you and I have talked about this in previous weeks, that the way that he played last year, I mean, when you just kind of looking at 2018 in totality, he was out of this world against average to bad defenses. And then against, arguably the best defenses that he faced, he wasn't very good. And you could say he was injured, and that was certainly true in the SEC championship game. But I think what most people are doing right now with Tua is they're looking at these numbers, and a lot of them might not recognize how far ahead of last year's pace he is right now, but they don't care. All they care about is what's going to happen when he faces Auburn, what's going to happen in the SEC championship game, and obviously what happens in the playoff isn't going to affect the Heisman voting. But I think that's where the jury is still out on Tua. It's not can he do what he's been doing against these defenses. What's he going to do, especially in the Iron Bowl on the road against a defense that that everyone has very high regard for. And we're going to get to see LSU face that same defense. Is it next week, I believe? So I think that'll be fun, to see what he's able to do there. And that's where the skeptics would finally be able to be silenced, because that's what they're holding out on, is to see what he does against a high caliber defense, especially on the road.
Well, listen, I'll say this: in the final 45 days, we are setting up for an awesome college football finish. I mean, I think this is going to be dynamic. I think it's going to be more. It's more than just Alabama and Clemson who have a seat at the table. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And we've got a front row seat.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a shame that there's no competition for Clemson in the ACC. I'm not sure how much Ohio State's going to be challenged in the Big Ten. We'll see whether whether Penn State or Wisconsin can give them a run. But yeah, I think the real drama is going to be in the SEC and what happens over the next 6 weeks or so. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out.
Hey, Brad, thank you again for some extra time here in Tuscaloosa. We appreciate it. I hope you have an
You got
awesome
it.
week.
Thank you. Anytime.